Although the 1920s was a time of great progress for women as they entered the workforce for the first time during World War I and they became an enfranchised group, women's roles in society were still extremely restricted and distinct from that of men. With the end of the war, women were once again relegated to household and child-rearing work as men regained their jobs and were held firmly under this patriarchal control. Any attempt to defy this discrimination was met with quick and severe punishment. While in public, women were expected to remain modest, and laws were passed specifically to preserve this imposed belief on how they should present themselves. For example, as swimming became a popular pastime, various seaside cities enlisted the police to patrol the beaches, ordering them to arrest any woman whose hemlines were more than 6 inches above their knees. They were also fined in all public places if they revealed too much skin, which in that time constituted as any skirt that rose more than 3 inches above the ankle, and were required to file for a permit in order to wear high heels. Women were also restricted in which type of jobs they could even apply to. Several states banned them from working in anything that could be considered as dangerous, which included becoming a taxi driver or working in pool halls and bowling alleys, among others. As such, they were only allowed to seek occupations that are now regarded as historically feminine, such as teaching, nursing, and secretarial work. These measures were promoted as protective laws, intended to protect women from the influence of disreputable men, belying the true nature of these acts, which was to discourage women from integrating themselves in the male-dominated public sphere. Pregnancy was also another way to ensure dismissal in the workplace. Since there were no laws to protect pregnant workers from discrimination, most employers would fire them months before their due date, citing the reason to be that giving birth would result in a decrease in productivity. Women face discrimination in every aspect of their life, from being policed on their clothing to even finding themselves unable to carry out even the most basic of functions due to male incompetence. As more and more women began to apply for jobs or to university, they found that most institutions offered very few female restrooms or none at all, in which case they were rejected from working for these institutions or attending them.
After World War I, women founded a new movement where they liberated themselves from previous ladylike standards that were implemented by their predecessors. As they broke social conventions, these women became known as flappers. The usage of the word entered American vernacular after the Great War. However, it originated in the United Kingdom as a word to describe an impetuous teenage girl. More or less, flappers were the new generation of young women in the 1920s that rebelled against the Victorian-era values established by the previous generations, such as their mothers and grandmothers. They expressed autonomy or their newfound freedom in several ways, fashion being one of them. They would cut their hair short and wore shorter dresses that showed a scandalous amount of skin compared to Victorian-era dresses. Although they used their body to express their freedom, their fashion was multi-purpose because the use of the short dresses made it easier for the women to move freely so they could dance. Another way they expressed liberalism was through their attitude, which was often stark, honest, fast-living, and sexual, which were characteristics that not commonly belonged to women because they were expected to be gentle, mature, and angelic creatures. Amongst living beyond the constraints of normal behavior, flappers clinged onto their youth as if it were going to slip out of their hands before they knew it. They made reckless and childish decisions that were considered dangerous for women because only men were expected or allowed to do them. Some of these actions consisted of driving cars and standing on the edge of a building's rooftop. Adding on to that, their image mainly consisted of smoking publicly, drinking alcohol, and dancing at jazz clubs, which were all actions women had never publicly taken before in the prior decades. In an attempt to express autonomy, women attempted to look boyish by tightly wounding their chest with strips of cloth in order to give a flat look, an act also known as binding. They could have done this for several reasons, such as continuing to attempt to cling on to their youth, because when women got older, they tend to become curvier. Therefore, a flattish look would make them look younger than they were. Nonetheless, flappers are currently considered the first generation of independent American women. Flappers pushed barriers in economic, political, and sexual freedom for their gender.
Just as Janice said, flappers were young, urban, single, and middle-class women who flamboyantly flaunted their contempt of what was deemed as conventional behavior in the 1920s. Due to their abnormal appearance, choosing to dress with short skirts and have bobbed hair, as well as their rebellious behavior, the flapper image came to be of a young, brash woman who attended jazz clubs, smoked cigarettes, and openly engaged in casual sex. Defying rules set at that time, flappers were known to frequent jazz clubs and vaudeville shows to supposedly dance all night. Though the 1920s was the decade of the Prohibition era, flappers regularly went to speakeasies and openly drank alcohol. They engaged in what was also considered disreputable behavior at that time. They wore a moderate amount of makeup, heels, and short dresses, drove cars, and rode bicycles. They were considered wild and disgraceful to the older generation, representing a group of women who insolently defied Victorian gender roles and the traditional behaviors expected of them. However, the flappers were also deemed to be free-spirited women who were one of the first to exercise their freedom and rid themselves of the rigid, older ideas of what women were supposed to be or behave.
The development of the Gibson girl in the 20th century demonstrated the image of what people perceived as female beauty in the late 1800s and early 1900s, fragile and vulnerable. The Gibson girl showed the traditional woman who relied on men to care for them. During this era, women felt as though they had to be seen as the Gibson girl, curvy, tall, and slender. In order to resemble this idea of what beauty meant to them, they wore swan-built corsets that forced their torsos forward and their hips into an S shape. These women were restricted from wearing what they wanted to wear and were prohibited from showing too much skin. The Gibson girl wore long skirts or dresses, no makeup, could only go on dates with guys their parents set them up with, and could not smoke or drink. After World War I, the mindset of women changed. Women realized that life was too short to wait around for a man who may or may not come back from war, and decided to spend the time they had enjoying all that life had to offer. During the 1920s, teenagers and young women who, instead of settling down to raise children and get married, pursued the life of having fun, mostly were what we know as flappers. Flapper girls astonished the world by pushing the limits of the average Gibson girl, setting new limits that were never foreseen before for women. Women were able to wear short skirts and not required to wear a corset. These flapper girls now had the ability to casually date whomever they liked, wear dramatic makeup, dance, and even smoke and drink in public. This new advancement led to a change in perception of the clothes, patterns, and lifestyles of the women of the 1920s. Women got the right to vote on August 26, 1920, which led to the realization of the larger goals of feminism, individuality, full political participation, economic independence, and sex rights. This idea of fulfillment and freedom encouraged women to think more independently on the things they wore and did. The flapper girl depicted the modern women, known popularly as a new woman, at a time when more women gained independence, began to work outside the home, and sought the right to vote and other rights. She exemplified the importance of intelligence and learning rather than catering to men's needs, leading to crossing of many societal lines, opening the way for women to participate in things they had never done before.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. This is an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence, drafted on June 11, 1776. With the movement against slavery, many women became inspired to see and fight against the inequalities their society pressed against them. The period from 1890 to the 1920s was called the Women's Era. Women had greater economic and political opportunities, such as the right to own property, control their wages, and make contracts and wills. Jeannette Rankin was the first congresswoman in 1916, also the only one to vote against entering both world wars. She was able to do so since holding office and voting were state rights, but did not take effect in all or many states. By the year 1900, almost 5 million women worked for a wage, mostly for domestic servitude or light manufacturing. There were also more education opportunities. Many college-educated women started and participated in movements to protest for their suffrage, one of these being Florence Kelley, who headed the National Consumers League. Women's role in the household gave them economic leverage, for they were the prime consumers for their family. Florence Kelley sponsored boycotts and shaped consumption patterns, encouraging products without child or sweatshop labor, which was prominent. There was also a subtle shift in gender roles at the time. More women worked outside the home. African American women worked primarily as domestic servants or in agriculture, while immigrant women mostly did low-paying factory jobs. Yet Native white women had new opportunities like office work and telephone operators. By 1920, 25% of the female workforce was composed of these, while 15% was of domestic servitude. In many ways, the 19th Amendment validated the role of women, not merely as companions or family laborers, but as their own entity in society. It acknowledged their voice in the polls, equal along that of men's. The coming November, hundreds of thousands of women voted, which was still very low compared to the turnout of men, a product of the internalized gender roles. Still, the amendment did not do away with stereotypes of the time, nor issues such as equal pay for equal work. It did, however, lead to more social movements, such as the prohibition of sex discrimination in the workplace, which is recognized in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.